My name is Tom Harris, and I've been working in radio for over 20 years. I've repaired equipment in remote locations, climbed towers in storms, and spent entire nights listening to the sound of static. But nothing prepared me for what I found at Tower 22. I got a call from a small community radio studio in rural Oregon. They were picking up a mysterious transmission coming from a radio tower that had been abandoned for over 2 decades. It was impossible. Tower 22 had no power and was not connected to any working transmitter. The studio technician sent me an audio file. It was a recording that started with static, and then a female voice whispered, "Help us. Please, help us." In the background there were footsteps and what sounded like a low moan. There was something unsettling about the sound, but I decided to dismiss it as just another technical job. A glitch, maybe a pirate radio. I grabbed my tools and drove over. The road was desolate, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow the evening light. The GPS stopped working about 10 kilometers away, and the sky began to close in with dark clouds. When I finally spotted the tower, it looked like a giant skeleton in the middle of the vegetation. Its red lights blinked intermittently, something that shouldn't happen without power. I stopped the car and got out, feeling the cold, heavy air around me. Next to the tower was a small concrete building, the old transmission building. I grabbed my flashlight and went inside. The interior was in ruins, control panels covered in dust, cables hanging from the ceiling, and a smell of rust mixed with mold. However, what made me most uncomfortable was the sound. A tape recorder, which shouldn't have been working, emitted static interspersed with fragmented words. "Please. You're late." I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. My name wasn't on the recording, but the feeling that someone was talking to me was undeniable. I picked up the recorder, but it stopped as soon as I touched it. The silence in the room was deafening. I continued my inspection and found an old diary in a partially opened drawer. The pages were yellowed, and the last few entries seemed rushed, as if the person writing them was afraid. One sentence was underlined several times. "Don't talk to them. Don't listen." My breathing became heavy. Something was very wrong here. I decided to climb the tower to check the transmission cables. Maybe there was some kind of interference that explained the transmission, but deep down, I knew I was trying to find a logical solution to something that didn't make sense. As I climbed the metal ladder, I heard footsteps in the building below. They were slow and rhythmic, as if someone was walking on the concrete floor. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I kept climbing, but the sound of the footsteps now seemed to follow me. When I reached the top, the wind howled around me, and the lights on the tower flickered erratically. I grabbed my tool and checked the connectors. They were all disconnected. There was no power. There was no way the tower could be transmitting. Then the radio on my belt began to hiss. Tom, can you hear us?" My hands shook, almost dropping the tool. The voice was female, the same as on the recording. But there was something different. It was clearer, as if it were close by, speaking directly into my ear. "Who are you? What's going on here?" I asked, trying to remain calm. The answer came in a cold tone, full of desperation. "You're late. He's coming." The radio turned off by itself. I looked down and saw something that made my heart stop. At the top of the tower, on the platform opposite me, there was a figure standing completely still. I couldn't see her face, but she seemed to be watching me. I ran down the tower as fast as I could, nearly tripping on the steps. When I entered the building again, I noticed that the tape recorder was working again, emitting a low, distorted laugh. I grabbed the diary and ran to my car. When I tried to start the engine, the radio on the dashboard tuned itself to the same frequency. "Help us, Tom. Help us." Whatever it was, Tower 22 wasn't going to let me off the hook that easily. The car radio kept playing the same phrase. "Help us, Tom. Help us." My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine again. Nothing happened. It was as if Tower 22 was draining all the energy around it, including mine. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car. The air was colder, almost biting, and the darkness seemed thicker. The flashing lights of the tower called to me, more and more mesmerizing. I heard the footsteps in the building behind me again, but now they seemed to echo from all sides. "Who's there? Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice reverberating in the void. No answer, just the sound of static that seemed to be coming from the sky itself. I walked back to the building, the diary clutched in my hand like a shield against whatever was happening. I flipped through the last few pages again, trying to find some clue. One name appeared several times: Henry Clark, the former tower operator. He described similar events, with voices coming over the radio, unexplained lights, and the feeling of being watched. One of the last entries read, "The tower draws us in. It wants more of us. I've tried to escape, but it always finds a way to bring me back." As I read, I heard the female voice again, this time clear and close. "You can't leave, Tom." I looked up and saw something that made my mind reel. In the reflection of a blank monitor, a group of figures stood behind me, motionless, watching me. I turned quickly, but the space was empty. I walked over to the transmitter in the center of the room. The lights were flashing wildly, and the sound of voices grew louder, filling the room. I recognized some of them: Henry's voice, the female voice, and, to my horror, my own. "This isn't real. It isn't real," I repeated to myself as I tried to turn off the equipment. Each button I pressed seemed to bring more voices. They were screaming now, desperately, as if they were fighting to escape from somewhere. It was then that I saw a button labeled System Reboot. Without thinking, I pressed it. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The static stopped, the lights went out, and the air felt less heavy. I thought I had succeeded. But then, the room began to shake. The walls cracked, and a black light began to emanate from the transmitter like a living shadow. The darkness spread quickly, swallowing everything around it. Before I could react, I heard a guttural laugh, which seemed to come from inside my own mind. "You can't turn off what's always been on." I ran out of the building, but the landscape had changed. The sky was completely dark, without stars or moon, and the tower seemed larger, almost infinite. In place of the road, there was an empty field covered in mist. On the horizon, I saw figures walking toward me. They had no faces, but they moved in perfect synchrony, their bodies floating lightly above the ground. The radio in my pocket began to hiss again. I reached for it, hesitantly, and heard my own voice. "You're late. He's coming." That's when I realized the voice wasn't just on the radio. It was in my head. The figures moved closer, forming a circle around me. Their bodies began to writhe, their arms reaching out like liquid shadows, slowly enveloping me. I struggled. I screamed, but it was useless. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the tower, shining brightly, like a beacon to something beyond this world. I woke up at the base of the tower with the sun rising on the horizon. Everything was quiet. The building was empty, and the transmitter seemed completely turned off. I struggled to my feet, trying to make sense of what had happened. My car was there intact, with the engine running. I drove back to the city, but something was wrong. People stared at me as if they didn't recognize me. When I went to the radio studio to report what had happened, I realized that there was no recording of the broadcast. To them, Tower 22 had never been active. As they spoke, I glanced at my reflection in a window and saw something that made my blood run cold. The faceless figure was behind me just for a moment before disappearing. The radio in the studio began to crackle, and a familiar voice echoed, "Help us, Tom. You're late." My name is Jake Thompson, and I've always thought my adventurous spirit would lead me to incredible stories to tell. But sometimes, curiosity can drag us to places we can never completely escape. That's what happened the summer I decided to explore the Black Swamp in Louisiana. I was traveling with my friends: Amy Carter, my childhood adventure partner; Eddie Blake, the funny one of the group, always ready to challenge fear; and Lila Montgomery, who had a keen sense of danger but never stopped following us. Our trip had been planned to be relaxing, but everything changed when we walked into a roadside bar where we heard the first stories about the swamp. "Are you guys going to the Black Swamp?" the bartender asked with a low, ironic laugh. He was a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes that seemed to observe more than speak. "Yes, we're thinking of exploring. Is there anything interesting there?" I asked, ignoring Lila's cautious look. If you think it's interesting to never go back, then go ahead. They say there's a ghost ship there, and when you hear the music, it's gone. It calls to you." Amy snorted, and Eddie laughed, raising his beer glass. "Ghost ships, Jake? Sounds perfect for your collection of idiotic stories." Lila, however, looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should reconsider. Places like this usually have a reason to be avoided." But the decision had been made. The next morning we rented a small boat and set off toward the swamp. The Black Swamp lived up to its name. The dark water reflected the tall, twisted trees around it, covered in moss that hung like ghostly curtains. The air was heavy, humid, and thick, with the constant sound of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. Mist crept across the surface of the water, creating the sensation that we were floating in the middle of a dream. Amy paddled along calmly, while Eddie fiddled with his camera, taking pictures of what he described as the scariest place on earth. Lila kept her eyes on the shore, as if waiting for something to emerge from the vegetation. "Have you guys noticed how quiet it is?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. That was when I heard it for the first time. It was a faint sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakably human. A slow, melancholy melody, as if someone were playing an old harmonium. The music seemed to echo from somewhere far away, but at the same time, close enough to make us uneasy. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking around. "Hear what?" Eddie answered, but Amy frowned. "It sounds like music." Lila squeezed my arm, her expression now filled with dread. "Jake, I think we should go back, now." But the sound was drawing me in, as if the swamp itself were calling to me. I followed the melody, rowing faster, despite Lila and Amy's protests. The music grew louder, clearer. It was mesmerizing, a combination of notes that stirred something deep and primal within me. That's when we saw it, a drifting boat, slowly moving toward us. It was a small boat, made of dark wood with cracked sides and signs of old age. There was no one visible on board, but the music seemed to be coming from within. The sound was louder now, almost oppressive, filling the air around us. Eddie reached for the camera but stopped mid-swim, his expression changing from comical to something close to panic. "There's someone there. I swear I saw someone." Amy tried to row in the opposite direction, but no matter how hard we tried, the drifting boat kept coming closer, as if it were being guided by an invisible force. "This isn't normal. It isn't normal," Lila cried, her eyes filling with tears. When the boat finally stopped a few feet away from us, the sound abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening. It was then that something began to emerge from the shadows on the deck. A skeletal figure wearing a worn sailor's hat. He didn't move, but he seemed to be staring straight at me. My heart raced as I realized the boat was waiting. It had come to pick us up. The silence that followed the music's cessation was absolute. The marsh seemed to hold its breath, and the figure in the boat remained still, like a statue, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the space around us. The fog had closed in, hiding everything beyond a few feet of the boat. We were isolated, alone. "Row, now!" I shouted, trying to sound in control, but my voice was shaking. Amy and Eddie grabbed the oars, but no matter how hard they struggled, the boat wouldn't move. The black waters around us felt thick, as if something invisible was holding us back. "It's pulling us in," Lila whispered, staring at the figure. Her eyes were fixed on her as if hypnotized. It was then that the music began again. It no longer came from the ghostly boat, but from the waters around us, each note reverberating through the marsh. The figure finally moved, tilting its head slightly to the side, like a predator examining its prey. With a slow, deliberate movement, he raised a skeletal hand and pointed at us. The water began to bubble around our boat. The bubbles erupted with strange sounds like muffled laughter and distant moans. Eddie, usually the most playful of the group, was in a panic, rowing frantically. "This isn't real, this isn't real," he shouted over and over. But it was real. The water began to change, transforming into something that seemed alive. I saw pale hands emerge, long, thin fingers reaching for the edge of the boat. Amy screamed as one of them nearly grabbed her. "Don't look at the water. Stay in the boat," I ordered, holding the oar like a weapon. But Lila stood still, muttering something to herself. Her eyes were fixed on the ghost boat, where the figure now stood, holding something that looked like an ancient instrument, like a harmonium. The music grew louder, more intense, and Lila began to stand up. "Lila, no!" I screamed, grabbing her arm, but she was stronger than I expected. She turned to me, and her eyes were now pale, empty, as if her soul had been drained. With a quick movement, she let go and jumped into the water. I saw pale hands holding her, pulling her into the depths as she disappeared without a sound. Amy was crying uncontrollably, and Eddie continued to row in panic, even though it was useless. The ghost boat was now beside us, and the figure pointed again, this time at Eddie. Before I could stop him, he let go of the oars and stood up as if in a trance. "Eddie, don't do it," I screamed, but he didn't respond. He stepped into the ghost boat without hesitation. As soon as his feet touched the deck, the music stopped again. Eddie looked back one last time, tears streaming down his face, and then the boat began to move away, disappearing into the mist. Now it was just me and Amy, floating in the oppressive emptiness of the swamp. The water was calm again, but the silence was more frightening than any sound. I looked over at Amy, who was huddled in the bottom of the boat, holding her knees. "We're getting out of here. It doesn't matter how, but we're getting out." I grabbed the oars and began rowing with all my strength. The fog seemed to move with me, resisting me, but I kept going. Every muscle in my body burned, but fear kept me going. Amy looked up at me, her eyes filled with dread and hope. "Jake, please don't stop. Just don't stop." The music started again, this time more distant, as if it were watching us go. I looked back one last time and saw the skeletal figure still standing in the boat, motionless, just watching. But something told me it wasn't over. After what felt like hours, we finally emerged from the fog. The trees around us began to look more familiar, and the water lost its oppressive black hue. A small dock appeared in the distance, and I forced myself to keep going until I reached it. Amy and I collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping in shock. The music had faded, and the swamp was suddenly too calm. I stood up and looked back. The fog still hung, but the ghost boat was gone. When we got back to town, we tried to tell them what had happened, but no one believed us. The locals said there had never been a black swamp, and no one remembered Eddie or Lila. Even the photos Eddie had taken were gone from the camera. It was as if they had never existed. But I knew the truth. Every night, when the silence of dawn takes over, I hear the same soft, hypnotic melody echoing in the distance. I know the boat is still there, waiting, and that one day it will come back to me. My name is Evan Williams, and I can safely say that I never should have accepted that challenge. I've always been the kind of guy who wanted to impress others, especially my friends. But that night at Pinewood Cemetery, I learned that there are things that shouldn't be challenged, and there are places that should never be visited. It all started as a Halloween prank. We were gathered on the old hiking trail that led to the cemetery. Me, Josh, Megan, and Tyler. Josh, as always, was the ringleader, the kind of guy who turned any conversation into a challenge that was impossible to ignore. "So, Evan, are you really going to play tough? Or are you scared of a few whispers?" Josh teased, laughing as he shone his flashlight in my face. "I'm not scared. It's just a cemetery, Josh. Nothing but rocks and dirt," I replied, trying to sound confident, but my voice was shaking a little. Megan looked at me with concern. She always had a sixth sense for these things, and she seemed uncomfortable from the start. "Maybe we shouldn't do this. Pinewood has a dark history. You've heard the legends, Evan. People hear their names whispered and they just disappear." Legends to scare children? Nothing more. I tried to dismiss her fear, but the truth was that her words bothered me. Tyler, who was chewing on a piece of candy, shrugged. "If he wants to go, let him go. Just remember to scream if the ghosts come, okay, champ?" When we reached the cemetery gates, a chill ran down my spine. They were rusted and covered in moss, and the trees around them cast long, twisting shadows in the moonlight. The wind blew hard, making the dry leaves on the ground rustle as if they were alive. Josh opened the gates with a loud creak and pointed inside. 30 minutes, Evan. Show me you've got guts, and I'll never call you a wimp again." I looked at my friends' faces, hesitating. Megan looked like she was going to cry. Tyler was laughing, but it sounded forced. Josh just smiled, confident that I wouldn't have the courage. "I'll prove it. You'll see," I said, crossing the gates. The cemetery was more terrifying than I had imagined. The tombstones were tilted, covered in moss, and so old that many of them had illegible inscriptions. The air was thick, cold, and filled with an oppressive silence. Every step I took seemed to echo as if something were following me. I walked for a few minutes, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, but then I heard it for the first time. "Evan." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The sound was soft, almost indistinct, but it was my name. I looked around, but there was no one there. Maybe it was the wind, I tried to convince myself. I kept walking, but the sound came back, this time clearer. "Evan, come to us." My stomach churned. The whispers seemed to be coming from multiple directions, echoing between the graves. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, but all I saw were shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The shadows didn't answer, but something in the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and a strange smell like wet earth and wilted flowers filled my nostrils. When I looked at a nearby headstone, I saw that the name on it had changed. It now read, "Evan Williams." My knees nearly gave out. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look at another headstone. The name on it was mine, too. And another. It was as if the entire cemetery was screaming that I shouldn't be here. I walked back to the entrance, trying to ignore the whispers that now seemed to be laughing at me. When I reached the gates, they were closed, even though no one had stayed to lock them. I pushed at them, but they didn't budge. "Josh, Tyler, Megan, get me out of here," I screamed, but the sound of my voice seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. It was then that I felt something behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I turned slowly and saw a tall, slender shadow among the tombstones, motionless but definitely watching me. Who are you?" I asked. But there was no answer. The shadow began to move, gliding toward me without making a sound. I ran away, tripping over graves and falling to the ground. When I looked back, it was still coming, slow but inevitable. I knew I had to get out of there. But how? Whispers now filled the air around me. They came from every direction, repeating my name in mocking, sadistic tones. I ran aimlessly, dodging tombstones and thorny bushes, while the shadows seemed to grow, stretching across the ground like claws trying to reach me. My flashlight trembled in my hand, and every time I looked back, the figure was closer. "Evan, come to us." The sound was clearer now, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. I stopped running, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, I realized that I had stopped in front of an ancient tomb, larger than the others, with an inscription that seemed newly carved. "Here lies Evan Williams." My body froze. The date of birth was correct. The date of death was today. "This can't be real. It can't be real," I screamed, but the echo of my voice seemed to mock me. I tried to move away, but the gravestones around me began to change. They now bore familiar names. Josh, Megan, Tyler, each had the same date of death. I screamed for my friends, but the only sound was the whispers, louder and closer now. The cemetery felt alive, taking shape around me. The trees leaned forward like giant hands, and shadows danced across the ground in a frantic pattern. My legs felt heavy, as if the ground were trying to pull me down. That was when I heard a scream. "Megan." I looked around, trying to locate the direction. I ran toward it, but the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever. I found a path that led to a ruined chapel in the center of the place. The door was ajar, and inside, I saw something that made my heart stop. Megan was kneeling before an altar covered in candles, surrounded by shadows that seemed to whisper in her ears. She was still, but her eyes were open, glassy, as if in a trance. Beside her, I saw Josh and Tyler in the same position. "Megan, Josh, Tyler, wake up." I ran to them, but as soon as I got close, the shadows turned on me. The shadows had faces now, but they were distorted, pale, with empty eyes and mouths twisted into terrible smiles. They whispered words I didn't understand, but each sound felt like a direct blow to my mind. I felt my vision blur as I tried to pull Megan away from the altar. "Get out! You don't belong here!" I screamed, but the only answer was a low, echoing laugh. The shadows closed in, and I felt invisible hands grabbing my arms and legs. I was pulled to the ground, my body sinking into the cold, damp earth. I fought with all my might, but it felt like the cemetery itself was alive, determined to consume me. That was when I saw the figure again, the tall, slender shadow that had been chasing me since the beginning. It loomed over me, its eyes glowing like white flames. She leaned in close, and her voice finally spoke clearly. "You belong to us now." I felt the earth rise up to my chest, cold and suffocating. My strength began to fade. As I sank, I saw Josh, Megan, and Tyler rise from the altar. Their eyes were blank, and their movements were clumsy, like puppets controlled by something invisible. "No, this can't be happening," I screamed, but my voice sounded weak and distant. I woke up on the ground in the cemetery with the sun rising over the horizon. The fog had cleared, and the place looked normal. I struggled to my feet, expecting to see Josh, Megan, and Tyler, but they were nowhere to be seen. I ran to the gate and found their car parked, empty. I looked around, calling out their names, but there was no response. I went to the local police station, trying to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The officers looked at me skeptically, saying that no one named Josh, Megan, or Tyler had ever been there. Even their houses were empty, as if they had never existed. A few weeks later, I began to hear the whispers again. They weren't coming from the cemetery this time. They were coming from my own house, in the walls, in the hallways, in the darkness of my bedroom at night. And then one day, I found a tombstone in my front yard. On it was my name, with the same inscription: "Here lies Evan Williams. You will never escape Pinewood." My name is Ethan, and I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. I've seen it all on the road: animals crossing in the middle of the night, horrible accidents, and even people trying to hitchhike in the most unlikely places. I never paid much attention to the stories other drivers told at stops: ghosts, cursed roads, and other nonsense. But one night, driving along a deserted stretch of Route 66, something happened that changed my life forever. I was in the middle of a long haul, hauling a load of appliances to a warehouse in Arizona. It was late at night, and the only things lighting the road were the headlights of my truck and the occasional glow of the full moon. The radio was playing a soft classic rock station, and the silence of the desert was almost comforting. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road next to a small rusty pole with a barely readable license plate. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it was from another time, something you'd expect to see in an old movie. Her dark hair fell in messy cascades over her shoulders, and she slowly raised her arm, signaling for me to stop. For a moment, I considered driving on. It wasn't uncommon to see strangers trying to hitchhike, and most of the time, it was safer not to get involved. But something about the way she stood, almost motionless, made me uncomfortable. I slowed down and parked the truck a few feet away from her. "Do you need help?" I asked, rolling down the window. She didn't answer right away. She just walked up to the passenger side, her steps slow and silent. When she got close enough, I noticed that her eyes were large and dark, almost without reflection. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost melodious. I hesitated for a moment, but then I unlocked the door. She climbed into the truck with precise movements, sitting in the passenger seat. Her dress was slightly dirty, as if she had been walking for a long time. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Straight ahead," she replied without looking at me. Starting the engine again, I started driving. The silence inside the cabin was oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of tires on the road. "What were you doing out here alone in the middle of nowhere?" I ventured, trying to break the awkward atmosphere. "Just looking for a way," she said, without going into details. As we drove on, I realized something was wrong. The radio started emitting static and the GPS went dark as if it had lost signal. "Damn GPS," I muttered, tapping the device. The woman didn't seem to notice any of this. She just stared straight ahead as if she knew exactly where we were going. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked suddenly, taking me by surprise. "I guess so. I mean, everything happens for a reason, doesn't it?" She smiled slightly but didn't answer. Her smile gave me chills. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't there. I could clearly see the empty bench where she should have been sitting, but nothing else. I swallowed hard, trying not to lose control. "So, where do you want to get off?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She pointed vaguely ahead to a dark, deserted area where the road seemed to disappear into the horizon. "Right there," she said. My breathing was heavy, and the discomfort was almost unbearable. Something inside me screamed to stop the truck and send her away. But before I could decide what to do, I realized that the landscape around us didn't change. It was as if we were stuck on the same stretch of road, with the same rocks, the same dry bushes passing by over and over again. When I looked at the dashboard, the digital clock was frozen. "This isn't right," I muttered, feeling a chill run up my spine. The woman finally turned to me. Her eyes now seemed deeper, like two pools of darkness. "There's no turning back on every road, Ethan." I froze. How did she know my name? Before I could say anything, the headlights went out for a moment, and when they came back on, the woman was gone. The truck's cabin was empty, but the smell of wilted flowers lingered in the air. The woman had disappeared, but the discomfort she had brought had not. The truck's cabin was cold. The smell of wilted flowers lingered, and the silence around me was absolute. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the road behind me. I took a deep breath and kept driving. Part of me wanted to believe that it was all due to fatigue, a trick of my mind after so many hours behind the wheel. But as I drove down the road, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The GPS remained off, and the radio emitted a low static. Even more worrying, the landscape around me seemed stuck in time. The same rocks, the same bushes, the same shadows. It was like driving on an endless loop. That's when I saw her again. She was in the middle of the road, a few meters away, standing still as if she had never left. Her hair swayed slightly in the wind, but the rest of her body was still. "It can't be," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. This time I didn't stop. I accelerated, determined to get through that vision. But when the headlights reached her, the light seemed to pass through her as if it were made of smoke. My heart raced, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, there she was again, stopped in the middle of the road, closer than before. I stopped the truck abruptly, the engine roaring before going silent. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the vehicle, the cold night air cutting into my skin. When I turned back to the road, she was no longer there. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight into nothingness. That's when I noticed something on the side of the road. An old, rusty car with broken windows and a dented roof. It looked like it had been there for decades, but the tire tracks around it were fresh. I approached the car cautiously. Inside, I saw a picture frame lying face down on the driver's seat. I picked it up and wiped the dirty glass with my hands. My blood ran cold when I saw the photo. It was the woman who had gotten into my truck. All around the car were belongings scattered about. Clothes, shoes, purses. It was as if someone had emptied a trunk in a hurry. Among the objects, I found several identity cards. I flipped through them, and each one belonged to a missing person, all dated within the last 20 years. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight, but I saw nothing, just the empty road. "You're staying here too." Her voice came soft, almost like a whisper in the wind. The flashlight flickered and went out. The air around me grew heavy, and a low sound began to grow. Footsteps, voices, something scraping against the asphalt. Then I realized I was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness. Men and women in torn clothing, their faces pale and empty. They moved slowly toward me, forming a circle. "Fate chooses who stays," the woman's voice said again. There she was, standing in the middle of the circle, her face now distorted into something that was not human. Her eyes, once dark, glowed with an intense, almost hypnotic light. I tried to run, but the figures blocked my path. I felt cold hands grip my arms and legs, pulling me to the ground. My screams echoed through the night, but were soon drowned out by the sound of static, the same sound that had come from the truck's radio. The last thing I saw was the woman's face leaning over me, her expression now a mix of sadness and pleasure. "Welcome to the road, Ethan." Days later, my truck was found parked on the same stretch of Route 66, with the engine still running and the doors locked. On the passenger seat was a dried rose and a handwritten note. "No one escapes the road." The documents found at the scene added to the already long history of unexplained disappearances on that part of the highway. No one could explain what happened to me, but other drivers reported seeing a female figure on the following nights, always waving to passers-by. And so, the road continues to take its toll. My name is Clara, and since I was little, I have always been fascinated by mystery. Maybe it was the effect of the fantasy and suspense books I devoured, or maybe it was something deeper, a curiosity that never seemed satisfied. It was this curiosity that took me to New Orleans, a city full of stories, legends, and places that seemed to come from another world. I was looking for inspiration for a photography exhibition about historical places. The theme of the exhibition was Silences of the Past, and New Orleans seemed perfect. Between the narrow streets, the old mansions, and the echoes of voodoo culture, something about that city attracted me like a magnet. It was one sunny afternoon while talking to a tour guide that I heard about the Cemetery of Eternal Night. According to him, it was a place avoided even by the bravest residents. "They say it was built on cursed ground," explained the guide with a somber expression. "Black magic practices, sacrifices, things that no one likes to talk about." That only piqued my curiosity. A place full of history and atmosphere, perfect for my photos. I ignored the warnings and decided to visit it before sunset. The cemetery was located far from the city center, surrounded by tall trees and worn stone walls. The entrance was marked by a rusty iron gate, with the name engraved in barely legible letters. As soon as I passed through the gate, I felt a chill, despite the heat of the day. The place was unlike anything I had ever seen. Ornate tombs, crypts that looked like small houses, and statues that seemed to watch whoever passed by. The silence was profound, interrupted only by the occasional sound of the wind blowing through the trees. I began taking photos, fascinated by the details of the tombstones and the Latin inscriptions. Many of them were covered in moss, but some had strange symbols that I could not identify. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, the cemetery seemed to change. The shadows lengthened, and the golden light made the environment even more surreal. It was then that I noticed something strange. As I adjusted the focus of the camera, I saw a figure in the background, between two crypts. It was a tall figure, dressed in black, motionless as a statue. "Hello?" I called, but received no response. When I lowered the camera, the figure had disappeared. I felt a shiver, but I kept taking pictures. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a visitor. But the uneasiness grew with each passing minute. A little later, I heard a sound. It was low, almost imperceptible, like a child's laughter, coming from somewhere to my left. I turned my head quickly, but saw no one. I kept walking, faster now, trying to find the exit. When I reached the main gate, my heart stopped. It was locked. I was sure I had left it open. I pulled hard on the rusty iron, but it didn't budge. "It can't be," I muttered, feeling the panic growing. I looked around, searching for another exit, but the cemetery seemed denser, as if the space had been compressed. The trees, once distant, now seemed closer, their shadows forming intricate patterns on the ground. It was then that I saw him again. The figure in black was standing a few feet away from me, between two tall tombstones. This time he moved, slowly, as if floating, disappearing behind a crypt. "Hey!" I shouted, more to dispel my fear than to get an answer. I ran toward him, but when I turned the corner of the crypt, there was no one. Just absolute silence. When I looked back, I saw something that made me freeze. The tombstones around me were different. The names engraved on them were no longer unfamiliar. Instead, they were filled with familiar dates, birth and death dates that corresponded to people in my family. And in the center of it all, a tombstone with my name engraved on it. The sound of laughter echoed again, but this time it seemed to come from all sides. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at the headstone with my name engraved on it. The date of death was marked as today. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of mistake or illusion. But when I touched the cold surface of the stone, I felt the clear indentation of the letters. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing throughout the cemetery. It was a macabre sound, one that didn't seem human. The shadows around me began to move. Trees that had previously seemed motionless now swayed, as if invisible winds were blowing through them. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw him, the figure in black. He was closer now, and I could make out details that had previously been invisible. His face was cadaverous, with sunken eyes that glowed red. He wasn't walking. He glided along the ground as if unbound by the laws of this world. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a long, bony hand, pointing to something behind me. When I turned, I saw one of the crypts open by itself, with a loud scraping sound of stone against stone. Inside the dark interior, something glowed faintly, as if calling to me. "No," I mumbled, stepping back. But it was too late. My legs began to move on their own, carrying me toward the open crypt. No matter how hard I struggled, it was as if an invisible force was pushing me forward. The interior of the crypt was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and decay was unbearable. In the center was a stone pedestal, upon which rested an ancient book. Its pages were open, and strange symbols were engraved on them, pulsing in a blood-red hue. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. The words made no sense, but there was something about them that felt familiar, as if they were being written as I read them. One sentence in particular made me freeze. The sacrifice must be complete for the gate to remain closed. Before I could process what it meant, I felt the ground shake. I looked back and saw that the figure had entered the crypt. He was closer now, his eyes glowing brightly. "You have opened the way, Clara," he said, his voice like muffled thunder. I tried to run, but I stumbled and fell to the ground. He approached slowly, and the shadows around him seemed to melt into him, making him even more imposing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "It's not what I want. It's what they want." He pointed to the entrance of the crypt, where other figures began to emerge. There were many of them, men, women, and children, all pale and haggard with empty eyes and crooked smiles. They whispered my name over and over like a chant. "You are the sacrifice, Clara, the price to keep the veil between the worlds." I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden wind that filled the crypt. The figure raised its hands and an invisible force lifted me off the ground, holding me in the air. I felt something cold and sharp press against my chest, and a sharp pain shot through my body. My vision began to darken, but before it was over, I saw the figure leaning toward me, its eyes burning with a triumphant glow. Welcome to the eternal night. The next morning, New Orleans residents reported hearing screams and laughter coming from the cemetery throughout the night. When authorities went to investigate, they found the gate open and scratch marks on the headstones as if something had gotten out. Clara's camera was found in one of the crypts. Her last photos showed humanoid shadows and the figure in black staring directly into the lens with a cadaverous smile. She was never seen again. But ever since that night, it is said that laughter and whispers can be heard in the cemetery, especially at sunset. And for the bravest who enter, there is always a new tombstone with a name engraved on it that no one recognizes. I've always been fascinated by forgotten places. There's something inexplicable about exploring ruins, hearing the stories that the weathered walls whisper. My name is Jake, and together with my girlfriend Emma, I dedicate my weekends to exploring abandoned places and documenting them in photos and videos. Our latest discovery took us to Florida, to the most eerie place we've ever encountered, Encanto Park. The park opened in the 1970s and was a popular destination for families, but a devastating fire closed it just a few years later. Many say the flames consumed more than just wood and plastic. They took souls, leaving something dark behind. We arrived at the park at dusk. The sun was still casting golden rays, but the shadows of the tall trees around it made the place seem plunged into darkness. The main gate was fallen down, overgrown with weeds, and the rusty sign barely made the words Encanto Park legible. "Sounds perfect for an epic video," Emma said, adjusting her camera. I nodded, but there was something in the air. A faintly sweet smell mixed with the metallic odor of rust that made me uneasy. We walked in. The first thing we saw was the Ferris wheel. It was tilted, its cabins dangling from broken chains, as if a strong wind might topple it at any moment. Beside it, overgrown carousels seemed buried in time, and roller coaster tracks poked out of the undergrowth. "Look at that!" Emma exclaimed, pointing to a cotton candy stand. Inside was a machine that looked like it had been used yesterday, with dried bits of cotton candy still stuck to the sides. "Strange," I muttered, running my hand over the machine. It was too clean for something that should have been abandoned for decades. As we walked deeper into the park, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the silence was broken by a faint but recognizable sound, the melody of a carousel. "Jake, are you hearing that?" Emma asked, looking around. I was. The sound was coming from far away, but it shouldn't have. There was no electricity in the park, and besides, the carousel we'd seen was completely destroyed. We followed the melody, our flashlights illuminating the way. We reached the center of the park, where a rusty control booth was partially hidden under a fallen tree. Inside, we found papers, tools, and a diary. The pages were yellowed but legible. The first few pages told of the park's construction and its early years of success. But as we progressed, the tone changed. One entry caught my eye. "The shadows appear after sunset. They don't speak, but I hear them. Something is wrong here, but no one believes me." I kept reading. The last few pages described rides running on their own, children's voices where there were no others, and shadowy figures wandering between attractions. The author wrote shortly before the fire, "The park never wanted to let anyone go. The souls that enter here are his." Emma read over my shoulder, and her expression changed from curiosity to fear. "I think we should go, Jake," she said, her voice low. I nodded, but as we stepped out of the booth, I realized something was wrong. The sound of the carousel was louder now, and dim lights were flickering in the distance, illuminating the Ferris wheel. "That's not possible," I murmured, pulling Emma closer. She pointed toward the entrance to the park. The gates, which had been down when we arrived, were now upright and locked with chains. The park seemed to be waking up. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, emitting a high-pitched metallic sound that tore through the silence. The lights that flashed in faded colors made no sense. There was no electricity in the park. Emma grabbed my arm, her pale face reflecting the fear I felt. "Jake, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely audible over the booming music of the carousel. We made it to the gates, but they were locked with thick chains that hadn't been there when we arrived. I tried to force them, but it was useless. I looked around looking for another way out, but the park seemed to have changed. The paths we had taken were different, as if the rides had moved. Suddenly, the sound of the carousel stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, looking back. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed in the distance, as if someone was running between the rides. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were shadows moving too fast to be human. "Jake," Emma began, but her voice trailed off. I followed her gaze and saw something that chilled me to the bone. Near the Ferris wheel, a figure stood. He was dressed like a clown, but the costume was dirty and torn. His face, partially covered by a faded mask, seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching us. "Come on, now!" I pulled Emma by the hand, trying to get us away from there. We ran aimlessly, passing stalls and rides, but the park seemed endless. Every corner took us back to places we had already been, as if we were trapped in a maze. The music came back, but this time it came from all sides, as if the entire park was alive. A mechanical sound mixed with the melody, and I realized that the roller coaster was working. Their rusty cars moved along the tracks by themselves, and children's voices echoed, laughing and shouting, but there was no one there. Emma stumbled and fell beside me. As I helped her up, I noticed something in her hand. She had found a piece of paper on the floor, crumpled and dirty. I unfolded it and saw a list of names written in shaky handwriting. At the bottom, the last two names were ours, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. "This can't be," I whispered, feeling panic overcome me. Emma began to cry. "Jake, they knew we would be here." Before we could think of another way out, the sound of footsteps came again, closer this time. Shadows began to form around us, and indistinct figures emerged from the rides. They were children, or what was left of them. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes glowed with a dull hue. They began to walk toward us slowly, as if they were surrounding us. The clown appeared again, this time closer. His grotesque grin widened, and he pointed toward the Ferris wheel, now spinning faster. "This way!" I yelled, pulling Emma toward a game booth. We hid behind the counter, trying to control our breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that looked like a key hanging from a nail. I grabbed it, hoping it was the key to the gates. "We need to get back to the entrance," I whispered. Emma nodded, and we ran as fast as we could. The figures began to move faster, their screams and laughter filling the air. We reached the gates, and I tried to fit the key into the lock. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. The key turned. The chains fell with a crash, and the gates began to open. But before we could get out, Emma screamed. I looked back and saw that she was being pulled. One of the childlike figures had grabbed her leg, and the others were closing in, dragging her back. "No!" I ran to her, trying to free her, but the shadows were too strong. Emma looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Go, Jake, get out of here." "I won't leave you," I screamed, but the shadows swallowed her completely. I stood still for a moment, unable to process what had happened. Then, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned and saw the clown, his eyes now glowing brightly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, through the gates and throwing myself onto the deserted road. Days later, I found the strength to go back with the police, but the park was no longer there. The place was empty, covered in trees and vegetation, as if the park had never existed. The only thing left was the diary we found, now with 2 more names added to the list, Jake Mitchell and Emma Carter. And every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the carousel music. My name is David Carter. I'm 32 years old and I work as a private investigator. I've always been a confirmed skeptic. Spirits, ghosts, mysterious disappearances. For me, everything had a logical explanation. It was just a matter of time and patience until I found the truth behind the legends. But nothing prepared me for that night on the Pine Ridge Highway in Colorado, a highway where the impossible not only seemed real, but was lurking, waiting for me. It was 11:50 p.m. when I pulled my old Ford Taurus to the side of the road. The engine hummed softly, but the rest of the world was plunged into an oppressive silence. I stared at the stretch of asphalt that stretched out in front of me, disappearing into impenetrable darkness. The trees on either side seemed to bend over the road, forming a dark tunnel. The wind blew softly, carrying the damp scent of pine and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, adjusting the dash camera on the car's dashboard. If anything strange happened, I would capture it on video. I gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath. Local legends spoke of drivers who disappeared after driving through here at midnight. Some returned days later, disoriented, with no memory of what had happened. Others were never seen again. The stories varied, but they had one thing in common. The clock always showed 11:55 p.m. when the problems began. I turned the key and the engine roared louder. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the cracked asphalt and dry leaves scattered on the ground. I began driving slowly, paying attention to every detail. The light from the headlights flickered as it met the shadows of the trees, creating distorted shapes that danced along the way. The silence was thick, as if the night itself was watching me. My eyes searched for anything out of the ordinary, but everything seemed normal. It was just an old, deserted road shrouded in a forest. Nothing more. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. When the clock on the dashboard read 11:55 p.m., I felt a chill run down my spine. The air inside the car seemed colder, and the silence outside grew even deeper. My headlights caught an old wooden sign by the side of the road, its letters almost faded by time. Pine Ridge, 5 miles. I kept driving. A few minutes later, I passed an old abandoned gas station. The windows were broken, and the rusty gas pump stood like a forgotten sentinel in time. I made a mental note of the landmark and drove on. But then something strange happened. After driving for a few more minutes, I saw the same gas station again. The same broken windows. The same rusty pump. My heart skipped a beat. "It can't be," I whispered. I glanced at the clock. It still read 11:55 p.m. I squinted, trying to figure out what was happening. Maybe I was tired, distracted. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I pressed the accelerator harder. The road continued to stretch out in front of me, an endless black strip. The trees all looked the same, motionless shadows watching me in silence. Then I saw something in the rearview mirror. A blurry shadow was moving behind the car. I couldn't see any details, just a dark shape that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. My heart raced. I turned my head to look back, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the headlights casting light into the darkness. "Calm down, David, it's just your imagination," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Cold sweat was running down my forehead. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I looked at the clock again. 11:55 p.m. Why isn't time passing? My voice was shaky. Suddenly the headlights flickered. For a second everything went dark. When the light came back on, the shadow was closer, visible in the rearview mirror. A tall, distorted, faceless figure. Just a silhouette made of pure emptiness. A chill ran through my entire body. Panic took over me. I stepped on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car hurtled down the road. The shadow disappeared for a moment, but the feeling that something was following me remained. The landmarks around me repeated themselves. The same gas station, the same fallen tree. It was as if the road was doubling back on itself, trapping me in an endless loop. "This is not possible," I screamed, feeling despair growing. The faint, distant laughter of something that shouldn't exist echoed in my mind. A voice whispered in the wind, "You shouldn't be here." I could no longer deny it. I was trapped in some kind of loop, a perfect trap, woven into the fabric of reality. The clock read 11:55 p.m. The same landmarks kept coming up over and over again. The abandoned gas station, the fallen tree with the lightning strike, and that shadow was getting closer with every passing moment. I floored the accelerator. The engine of my old Ford Taurus roared, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. My eyes were wide, sweat dripping down my face. The chill of fear spread through my body like ice running through my veins. "This isn't real. It can't be real," I screamed to myself, trying to hold on to my sanity. But no matter how fast I drove, it felt like the road was taking me back to the same starting point. It was as if time itself was folding in on itself, trapping me in an endless loop. In the rearview mirror, the shadow was still there. A distorted figure, an absence of light that seemed to devour everything around it. Every time I looked, it got closer. I could feel a cold presence, an invisible pressure that squeezed my chest and stole my breath. Suddenly, the car began to lose power. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The headlights went out, leaving me in total darkness. The silence was absolute, as if the entire world had held its breath. Not now. I hit the steering wheel, but the car gave no sign of life. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and turned it on. The flickering light cut through the darkness for a few meters ahead. Outside, the forest seemed denser. The shadows between the trees seemed to move. Everything in me screamed to stay inside the car, but a stronger part, the survival instinct, forced me to get out. I slowly opened the door. The air was cold and smelled strange, a mixture of wet earth and rusty metal. My feet stepped onto the cold, cracked asphalt. The light from the flashlight trembled along with my hand. "I need to get out of here," I whispered. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the road and the familiar details that I had seen countless times that night. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating. Then there was the sound, a heavy footstep right behind me, then another, like the hooves of an animal hitting the asphalt. I turned around in a sudden movement, the flashlight almost falling from my hand. The light illuminated only the emptiness of the road. There was no one there. But the sound of the footsteps continued, getting closer, louder and louder. "Who's there?" I shouted, desperation overflowing my voice. The silence returned for an endless second. Then a weak, distorted voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. I turned the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, only darkness staring back at me. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, distorted, like a silhouette made of pure emptiness. It had no face, just a black hole where its eyes should be. It moved toward me, slow and inexorable. With each step, the darkness seemed to fold around it, as if it were an extension of its very essence. My lungs burned, the air refusing to enter. I knew that if that thing caught up with me, I would disappear like so many others before me. Finally, my legs obeyed. I turned and ran. I ran with everything I had, my muscles screaming in protest, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of its footsteps followed me, steady and constant, always just a few feet away. The road stretched out before me, but now something was different. A dim light shone in the distance, the headlights of my car, which had somehow come back on. With one last effort, I dove into the car and slammed the door. I turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life. I stepped on the gas, the tires screeching on the asphalt. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood on the road motionless, its outline already dissolving into the darkness. But the eyes, or the void where the eyes should have been, were watching me. A silent promise that this was not over. The road finally changed. I saw the Pine Ridge exit sign approaching and speeding past me. The clock on the dashboard ticked to 12:01 a.m. I was free. But as I drove away, a sinister doubt crept into my mind. How many times had I believed I had escaped before? And how many more times would I return to this road? Some legends are not just stories, they are traps. And some prey never quite escape. My name is Lucas Bennett. I'm 25 years old and I'm an urban explorer. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places and their stories. I think it's the mystery, the unknown, or maybe it's just the adrenaline rush of being in places no one else dares to go. It's as if these places are waiting for someone to discover their buried secrets. And this time, my destination was the old gold mine in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The mine had been closed since the late 1800s, after a collapse that claimed the lives of dozens of miners. According to local legend, their spirits never left. Some people said that a shadow protected the remaining gold, keeping away anyone who tried to enter. I didn't believe these stories. To me, it was just an old mine, full of dust and superstition. It was almost sunset when I reached the entrance to the mine. The orange sky contrasted with the darkness that seemed to emanate from the tunnel. The entrance was an archway of old rotting wood and a rusty sign hung from a broken chain. No trespassing. I ignored the sign. I adjusted my backpack on my back, turned on my flashlight, and took a deep breath. "Let's see what you have to hide, mine," I muttered to myself. trying to hide the growing uneasiness in my chest. I took the first step inside. The air immediately grew colder, damper, thick with the smell of earth and rust. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating old tracks, rusty mining carts, and walls that seemed to sweat moisture. The sound of my footsteps echoed as if the mine itself were alive, breathing with me. I walked slowly, taking pictures of the abandoned equipment and old support beams. Each click of the camera seemed too loud, as if I were disturbing something long dormant. After a few minutes, I came to a fork. A tunnel led off to the left, even darker and narrower. Another one went straight ahead, with the ceiling a little higher. I looked at both, feeling an invisible pressure pulling me towards the tunnel on the left. Sure, let's go the scariest way, because why not? I grumbled, trying to laugh, but my voice sounded hollow. I walked down the narrow tunnel, the flashlight only illuminating a few feet ahead. The walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower. The air was thick, as if something heavy was hanging over me. Each step made the wood creak beneath my feet. That was when I heard it for the first time. A low, distant sound, like a pickaxe hitting stone. I stopped abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. It must be the echo of my footsteps, I whispered, trying to convince myself. But the sounds continued, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper in the mine. A cold sensation crept up my spine. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. I kept walking, increasingly aware of the weight of the darkness around me. My hands were sweating despite the cold. I looked back and saw the darkness swallowing the way back. Don't think about it, Lucas. You're in control, I said to myself, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. Suddenly I saw a shadow move on the periphery of the flashlight's beam, a quick, fleeting movement, but real. I stopped and swung the flashlight, illuminating the walls. Nothing. Just stone, wood, and darkness. It must be just a bat, I said, but my voice was shaky. I took a few more steps and heard another sound, shuffling footsteps, closer this time. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Fear began to set in for real. Okay, you've seen enough, I whispered. It was time to go back. But when I tried to go back, something was different. The tunnels seemed to have changed. The path I had come from now branched off in several directions. A chill took over my body. I was lost. The flashlight's light began to flicker. My lungs tightened. The echo of footsteps continued, louder now, as if someone or something was approaching. Is anyone there? My voice echoed through the darkness. The only answer was a low, icy laugh, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from all sides at once. You shouldn't be here. My heart stopped for a second. Panic took hold of me. I spun in every direction, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows seemed to come alive, dancing just out of reach of the light. And then I saw it. A dark figure, tall and distorted, watching me from the end of the tunnel. The shadow took a step forward, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there, I would never get out again. The figure in front of me was an absence of light, a silhouette of pure darkness silhouetted against the gloom of the tunnel. It seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing along with the mine itself. I could see no face or details, only that tall, distorted form watching me. My heart was hammering so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. My lungs seemed to close, each breath short and shallow. The flashlight trembled in my sweaty hand, the weak beam struggling to keep the darkness at bay. The figure took another step forward. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shake. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and a smell of sulfur and burnt metal invaded my nostrils. A low, drawn-out whisper cut through the silence, like the sound of one stone scraping against another. You shouldn't be here. My legs finally obeyed the command my mind was desperately screaming. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, without looking back. The tunnels were a tangled maze, but at that moment it didn't matter. I had to get away from this thing. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the narrow walls. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find the exit, but all I found was more tunnels, more darkness. The shadows seemed to close in around me, as if the mine were moving to trap me. And then I heard it. Heavy footsteps behind me. They weren't echoes of my own footsteps. These were slower, more shuffling, but unmistakable. The shadow was following me. "No, no, no!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. I kept running, stumbling over loose rocks and rusty rails. My flashlight began to fail, the light flickering wildly. With each flicker, the tunnel ahead of me became a gaping maze of pure darkness. And then I tripped over a fallen beam. My body hit the cold, hard ground, the flashlight slipping from my fingers and rolling a few feet forward, landing with its beam pointing upward. I felt pain explode in my knee, but fear was greater than the pain. I looked up and saw the flashlight flickering, casting distorted shadows on the walls of the mine. And then I saw the figure again, standing just beyond the light. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its invisible eyes boring into me. "Please." My voice was barely a whisper. The shadow began to move closer. Each step I took made the air around me grow thicker, as if the mine itself were closing in. The pressure in my chest increased and I couldn't breathe. Then I saw something reflect in the dim light of the flashlight, a small opening in the wall to my right, nearly hidden by a pile of rocks. It was narrow, but perhaps large enough for me to squeeze through. Gathering the last of my strength, I crawled toward the opening. The pain in my knee was excruciating, but panic made me ignore it. The shadow was almost upon me. The cold was unbearable, as if it were sucking the warmth from my soul. With one last effort, I pushed myself through the opening. The rocks scraped my arms and tore my shirt, but I managed to squeeze through. On the other side, a narrow passageway opened upward, and a faint light, natural light, filtered through a crack in the ceiling of the mine. The shadow stopped at the entrance of the opening. It could not follow me there. The cold eased slightly, and I could breathe again. The figure stood there, motionless, watching. Then, with a final whisper, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a feeling of emptiness. Fighting to stay conscious, I dragged myself toward the light. Each movement seemed to take forever, but finally I reached the crack. With an almost supernatural effort, I pulled my body out. The cool morning air hit me like a punch. I rolled away from the entrance and lay on the cold grass, panting, my eyes closed. The rising sun tinted the sky with orange and pink hues. I was alive. When I finally opened my eyes, I looked back. The mine entrance seemed small and insignificant now, a mere crack in the rock. But I knew what was down there. I knew that the shadow was still waiting, guarding the secrets and lost souls of that cursed mine. I struggled to my feet, pain in every fiber of my body. I left my flashlight and gear inside. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave and never come back. As I limped back to my car, one last sentence echoed in my mind, repeated by the cold mountain wind. "You shouldn't be here." And for the first time in my life, I knew the legend was real. My name is Chris Miller. I'm an 18-year-old high school senior, and to be honest, I've always loved horror stories. The scarier, the better. But to me, all these urban legends are just that. Stories. Things made up to scare the easily impressed. So when I heard about the haunted cornfields of Fort Collins, my first instinct was to laugh. It's said that farmer Thomas Grady cursed his land after losing everything in a mysterious fire decades ago. Some claim he still walks the cornfields, waiting to exact revenge on anyone who dares trespass on his property after sunset. It's a good story to tell on Halloween night, but nothing more than that. "Shall we go, guys?" I asked my friends as we parked the car near the fields. The night was cold and the sky was clear, with a full moon casting a silvery glow across the landscape. Mike, my best friend, smiled as he adjusted his flashlight. Ready to prove this legend a hoax? Dylan, the most hesitant of the group, snorted. "I don't know why we're doing this. This doesn't seem like a good idea." I laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. "Relax, Dylan. It's just a cornfield. What could happen?" The entrance to the field was just ahead, marked by an old, weathered wooden fence. The dry leaves of the cornfields rustled in the wind, creating an unsettling sound. The trail ahead of us was a narrow strip that disappeared between the tall, dense rows of corn. "Let's go in," Mike said defiantly. We climbed over the fence and started walking along the trail. Our flashlights illuminated the path ahead, but the shadows of the cornfields closed in around us like living walls. The ground was covered in dry leaves that crunched beneath our feet. "Have you heard of the disappearances here?" Mike asked with a mischievous smile. "They say some people go into these fields at night and never come out again." "That's nonsense," I said, rolling my eyes. "People get lost because these fields are so big, that's all." But as we walked, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest. The wind seemed colder in here, and the sound of the corn leaves rustling against each other was like muffled whispers. After a few minutes, I noticed that the trail seemed narrower. The rows of corn were closer together, as if they were closing in around us. I glanced around and felt a twinge of discomfort. It was as if we were being watched. "Did you feel that?" Dylan whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Like someone was here." "It's just your imagination," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But the truth is, I felt it too. Something was wrong. Suddenly we heard a muffled sound of shuffling footsteps coming from somewhere between the rows of corn to our left. We stopped in our tracks, our hearts pounding. The flashlights shook in our hands. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, turning the flashlight to the left. Nothing. Just dense cornfields and leaves swaying gently in the wind. But the footsteps continued, slow and heavy. Each time the sound stopped, the silence became even more oppressive. "This isn't funny," Dylan whispered. "Let's get out of here." Let's just see what it is," I said, trying to ignore the tight knot in my stomach. We took a few more steps, the flashlights illuminating only the leaf-strewn ground and the tall stalks of corn. Then the smell came. A smell of smoke and burning earth. My heart skipped a beat. "Do you smell that?" I asked, my voice coming out lower than I intended. "Yes," Mike murmured. "It sounds like something is burning." And then I saw it. A quick, almost imperceptible movement in the cornfields ahead. A tall, distorted shadow with the outline of a man, but the details were blurry, unreal. "There's someone there," Dylan whispered, his face pale. I wanted to tell him it was just our imaginations, that there was nothing there, but I couldn't. The wind carried a faint whisper, a hoarse, distant voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. For the first time, I felt real fear settle in my chest. I looked at my friends. The panic was clear in their eyes. And then, without another word, we ran out. We ran without looking back, our feet crunching through dry leaves as the cornfield swallowed us up on all sides. The sound of our heavy breathing mixed with the frantic rustling of the plants. Each step seemed to take us deeper into the suffocating maze. The smell of smoke and scorched earth grew stronger by the second. "This way!" Mike shouted, pointing his flashlight to the right. Without thinking, we followed the flickering light. My legs burned, but fear drove me on. Shadows danced around us, and the feeling of being followed was so strong it felt tangible. I could feel invisible eyes watching us, judging our every move. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling footsteps returned. This time they were closer, as if someone, or something, was right behind us. "Don't stop!" I shouted, panic filling my voice. Dylan tripped over an exposed root and fell to his knees. His flashlight rolled away, briefly illuminating a shadowy figure that disappeared into the cornfields. "Dylan, get up!" I pulled him by the arm with all my strength. He's here," Dylan stammered, his eyes wide and filled with tears. Mike stared at us, his teeth clenched, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here now." We started running again. The field seemed endless. Every trail we took seemed to close behind us. It was as if the corn itself was trapping us, leading us to an inevitable fate. "This doesn't make sense," I shouted, my voice mixing with the sound of the wind. "The trail should be here." Mike stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight on an ancient scarecrow in front of us. Its clothing was burned, the scraps of dark fabric hanging from its straw body. Its face was a charred mask of agony, its eyes made of black buttons, empty and lifeless. "This wasn't here before," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Before we could react, the scarecrow leaned forward as if watching us. A gust of wind brought a hoarse, deep voice. You shouldn't be here. My blood ran cold. The black buds seemed to glow red, like embers about to go out. "Run!" I screamed, pulling my friends away from the nightmare. We moved in sheer desperation, Dylan's screams echoing in my ears. The smell of smoke became unbearable. The leaves of the cornfields began to burn, small flames spreading quickly. The trail ahead of us was closing in on a sea of fire and ash. "We're going to die here," Dylan whimpered, his tears tracing grooves on his dirty face. "We're not," I screamed, trying desperately to hold on to hope. "There has to be a way out." We turned a corner and came face to face with an old wooden fence. It was tall, but there was a broken section that could be our salvation. Without hesitation, I pushed Dylan forward. "Jump. Go, go." Dylan stepped through the fence, followed by Mike. I was about to cross when I felt a cold, rough hand grab my wrist. I turned and saw a tall, distorted figure. His skin looked like ash, his eyes glowing like red embers. A guttural voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A cold pain shot through my arm. My eyes filled with tears, but adrenaline took over. With a scream of sheer determination, I managed to pull my arm free and crash through the fence, landing heavily on the other side. Mike and Dylan pulled me away, and we ran across the open field until our legs gave out. When we finally stopped, the fire was gone. The field was dark and silent again, as if nothing had happened. The scarecrow, the shadowy figure, the smoke, everything was gone. I fell to my knees, panting, staring at the cornfield in front of us. It was untouched, with no signs of fire or any sinister presence. Everything looked so normal that it was impossible to believe what we had just experienced. Was that real?" Mike whispered, his voice cracking. Dylan hugged his knees, shaking. I'm never going back there." I looked at my wrist. A red handprint was etched into my skin. It was cold to the touch, as if death itself had touched me. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." As we walked away, a gust of wind blew across the field, carrying the faint sound of a low, vengeful laugh. The smell of smoke returned for a moment, then disappeared. I knew we would never forget that night. Some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. And no matter how hard we tried to run, the curse of the Fort Collins cornfields would live with us forever.